and it's wonderful to see people again. And really, I'm always excited to meet the community, Rav Menachem and Doron, and of course everyone else that I seem to recognize already from the past two shiurim, and of course from my visit in Amsterdam. But it's really wonderful. I chose a topic tonight, which is a very unusual topic, and I have to admit that it's not really connected to Shavuot, but it's a fun topic. And like many things that are fun topics, we can always somehow connect them if we really need to. So let's understand how I can connect coffee to Shavuot. I have a source sheet that I might use in the next few minutes. I send it to one of you to maybe if you could put it out, but I will refer to it and I will look at it every so often, hopefully. But in this source sheet, I referred to an article that was written a few years ago by some Jewish academic who argued the following. He said that coffee made its way into Italy and into Europe. Oh, Sjioer, I see someone drinking coffee there. In the 16th century, I mean, I know that Solomon is drinking Corona beer, but anyway, we're gonna try to drink coffee now. It somehow entered Europe in the 16th century, and since then, nothing has been the same. Coffee, as we know, has changed a lot of different customs or cultures, or has an impact on our society. And one of them, he proves in this article, was the religious rituals that were done within the Jewish community changed as a result of coffee. And what specifically? Tikkun Leil Shavuot. As you know, there are 2 times a year that there is a custom to stay up all night. One is Tikkun Leil Hoshana Rabbah, the night of Hoshana Rabbah, and one is Tikkun Leil Shavuot. Why do we call it a Tikkun? What are we trying to fix by staying up all night Shavuot? So we have a tradition that originally when the Torah was given, the Jews at Har Sinai fell asleep. And when they came to the Torah to be given, they were all asleep. I don't know if you know, I have to be very careful. There's a very famous joke about what time Torah was supposed to be given and what time certain Jews showed up for it. I don't know if I can tell this joke in public. They say, Rabbi Sebak, I can say the joke? I can say the joke. They say that, the Torah was supposed to be given at 10 o'clock in the morning, 10 a.m. And so the Yekes, the Germans, they of course are Yekes, so they came early. So they came straight for the Derech Eretz Kadma la Torah, right? It says that Derech Eretz was given before the Torah. So they came, got the Derech Eretz, and went home without the Torah. They got all the manners and went home. The Briskers, the Lamdanim, they came at 10 o'clock and they got the Torah. The Hasidim were still sleeping at 10 o'clock. They only came for the Kiddush after Torah was given. That was the joke. But the truth is that the midrash is that we all fell asleep. So to fix that in every generation, the minhag is to stay up at night and to correct this mistake that shows that we're not that excited to receive the Torah. However, it's very hard to stay up all night. So when coffee came into Italy and into Europe in the 16th century, the rabbis were so excited, and they treated the coffee as a sign from the heaven. It's a magical potion. It must have religious kind of meanings to it, because now that we have coffee, we can stay late up all night. We can just drink coffee after coffee, and it's keeping us awake. It'll allow us to learn more Torah. It'll allow us to keep awake till the morning, till Shacharit and receiving of the Torah. And as a result, he proves that the minhag of tikkun chatzot started. There's a minhag, I don't know if anyone is familiar with this minhag, I've never done it, but there's a minhag also at midnight to say a tikkun for the Churban Beit HaMikdash. If you ever go to the Kotel, by the way, at midnight, you will see people sitting on the floor and saying special prayers for the destruction of the temple. And again, this minhag probably started or got a lot of strength to it when coffee was already part of a common drink that was easy to get. Once coffee was spread and found in the Jewish communities, then they were able to stay up late at night and perform these Jewish rituals. However, what's fascinating that at the same time, coffee started at that point to be associated with very naughty behavior too, because coffee can work both ways. It can allow now certain institutions to stay up late at night with that naughty things are going there. And the coffee shops, now I know I'm saying this, the word coffee shop in Holland has different connotations, but in Israel, a coffee shop is really a place where you only drink coffee. But in a classic coffee shop where you just drink coffee, apparently in the 17th century in Europe was associated with prostitution because it allowed people to stay up later and to party later. And that's why you will find sources in Jewish law that disapprove going to coffee houses because coffee was associated with a certain type of immoral behavior that was going on at the same time. So it's very interesting how coffee, on one hand, was associated with Torah, with learning, with staying up late at night, and therefore was looked upon as a very important drink. And at the same time, it was looked upon as something more negative, as it also was associated with naughty nightlife that was going on at the time in Europe. So that's basically my introduction to this topic of coffee and halacha. And I would like to prove that the different questions that came up in Jewish history regarding coffee are not just about the coffee, but rather its place in the culture. I'll prove this in a second as I go through different cases and questions that came up regarding coffee. I'm going to discuss in the next few minutes different questions that came up in the past, comes up today regarding coffee as a drink. Let's start with a halacha that appears in the Gemara already, which is that you're not supposed to eat or drink before davening. If you look at the source sheet that I have here in front of me, second, we'll go up to the source sheet. I actually have a lot of it in English. Hopefully that will, here we go. I'm reading the Gemara in Hebrew, but please feel free to follow in English. Amar Rabbi Yitzchak, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Mai dichtiv lo tochlu al hadam. The pasuk says, you shall not eat blood or on the blood. The Gemara understands, lo tochlu kodem shitpalu al damchem. You're not supposed to eat before you pray on your blood. Okay, before you, meaning the idea is that praying to God is asking him to protect ourselves, to be healthy, to be strong, to be alive. So it's not right that you should eat before you ask God to protect your body. The Gemara goes on and says that it's more than that. It's a sign of haughtiness. The Gemara says, Kol ha'ochel v'shoteh ve'achar כך mitpalel, a person who eats and drinks, has a whole meal, right? Before he prays, is al tikre gavecha ela ge'echa, ga'ava. It's arrogance to eat and drink before davening. This Gemara brought the Shulchan Aruch to say the following: Asula, it's prohibited for a person to go on a journey, to do anything before he davens. V'lo le'echol v'lo lishtot. Mayim mutar lishtot kodem tefillah. You're allowed to drink water before you daven. V'chein ochalim u'mashkin l'refuah mutar. If it's for health reasons, you can also eat or drink. And for all those who are a bit nervous right now, so the Shulchan Aruch says that if you're very thirsty or hungry, you're considered choleh. And if you can't, because of that, daven, well, you're allowed to eat. This is, the Shulchan Aruch says here, especially I would say that on Shabbat and Yom Tov, where people daven very late, and davening goes on for a very long time, if it's difficult for a person to concentrate and to pray, he is considered as if he is a sick person, and therefore would be permitted to drink and eat before davening. What I'm interested, however, is in the Mishnah Berurah. Now, the Mishnah Berurah was written in the beginning of the 20th century. And he was concerned with a custom that was very much the custom, the norm, to drink tea or coffee before davening. I believe that is a custom that still goes on today. Many people, before they go to davening, I actually sometimes see people actually going to shul with a cup of coffee in their hands. In some shuls, you'll see people in the shul itself with a cup of coffee. And the Mishnah Berurah discusses, is coffee and tea more like water or not? Now, I find this fascinating because, as I said before, this is not just about drinking a hot drink, but it also proves to us the status of coffee 100 years ago. Why? Listen to this. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Tei ve'kafeh, you like how he writes it? Look, Tei ve'kafeh. You see it? My grandfather used to say that every hot drink has a source in the Torah. He says, Tei goes with Tehei Asha Azot Shat Rachamim, and kafeh, he used to say, Kafeh el Hashem, chazak v'yametz libecha v'kafeh el Hashem. And for soda, he used to quote the pasuk Mizmor Soda, but that's a joke. But anyway, let's go on. Anyway, tei v'kafeh mutar lishtoto kodem atfilah. Why? Kedei shulchan lechaven da'ato lidpalel. ובפרט במקומות שברגלים בהם, ואין מתיישב הדעת בלתם. Isn't that great? The Mishnah Berurah says, especially in places where people cannot concentrate, cannot start their day without tea or coffee. And if a person really feels that he's not able to focus without his first cup of coffee, then it makes sense that he would be permitted to drink. Now, this is already 100 years ago. The Mishnah Berurah is telling us how the custom is that the first thing you must have in the morning is a cup of coffee. But here is where it gets more interesting. He adds, Kol ze belot sukar uvelo chalav. You can have your cup of coffee, but no sugar and no milk. He says, actually, ha'olam nohagim lahakel lishtot in sukar. He said, the minhag is to drink coffee with sugar, but no milk. Why not? He says, Be'efshar, that the reason for this is, Dimat sukar ein lecha ga'ava gdola mizo. Isn't that interesting? What did we say that the main reason that you shouldn't drink or eat before davening is? Because it's arrogance to eat and to take care of your body needs before you daven. Says the Mishnah Berurah, drinking coffee is allowed. Why? Because coffee gives you the possibility to have more kavana, to daven better. But sugar in your coffee? Whoa, that's arrogance. To come and say, look at me, I'm drinking sugar with my coffee, that's too much. And then he says, however, im notenat sukar betoch hatei lemotko, if the reason that if you're drinking putting if you're putting the sugar in the coffee or in the tea, that's arrogance. But if you put it me'at sukar besiv, because it's hard to drink it, he says some people, as we know, this is a very European custom. I don't know if people still do today in Holland, to put a cube of sugar in your mouth and sip the tea or coffee through the sugar, right? I think that Israelis would not understand this Mishnah Berurah. Is this custom still done in somewhere in I know it's in English. English people still do this. They drink coffee through a sugar cube. You know what I'm talking about? Am I making sense here? So the Mishnah Berurah says that's okay. Why? Because that just is because it's hard to drink tea or coffee without anything sweet. But to actually dump the sugar in the coffee, whoa, that's gava. I always tell people that this Mishnah Berurah reminds me of something that my father told me. My father said that in Europe, hundreds of years ago, there was a saying in the Jewish communities to try to explain Rothschild, the wealth of Rothschild. And they used to say that a poor man drinks his tea or coffee without sugar. A person who has a bit of money, takes a cube of sugar and puts it in his mouth and drinks the coffee or tea through the sugar cube. A wealthy man takes 2 cubes. One puts in the sugar in the tea, one in his mouth and drinks it through, sips it through. But Rothschild sits in a room full of sugar when he drinks his cup of tea. That was a kind of story to show, what it meant to be really wealthy. So the Mishnah Berurah is really telling us that to drink sugar is considered a sign of arrogance. And therefore, better not to drink it with sugar, but milk is okay. However, Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, one of the great poskim of Yerushalayim, who died 20 odd years ago, he already in the 80s and the 90s wrote that today it's permitted to drink coffee with tea, with sugar and with milk, because he says everybody drinks it with sugar and milk. You don't have to be a wealthy person or of a special status to drink your coffee with milk or sugar. And therefore he says you can drink your coffee with sugar and milk before davening. So it's interesting to see how the minhag, the custom of how we drink our coffee actually changed the opinions of drinking the coffee before davening. I'm just playing with this idea that maybe if that's really true, then you can drink coffee before davening, but you shouldn't have a latte. A latte, that's already a sign of gaiva, of arrogance, to have a latte coffee. Or maybe you can argue, today everyone has a coffee machine in their house already, so maybe it's already considered to be something regular and normal, and therefore that's also permitted. So that's one area of discussion that I thought was interesting about coffee. There's another discussion which I would like to discuss, which is, are you allowed to drink coffee made by a non-Jew? Now, why would that be a problem? If you go back to the source sheet that I made before, you will see that the Halacha in Shulchan Aruch says the following. I'll read the English. A food that is not actually introduction. The Gemara says that in order to create distances between Jews and non-Jews, one should not eat food that is cooked by a non-Jew. We call that bishul akum. However, because it's very difficult to keep such a law, our rabbis permitted to eat food, obviously if it's kosher, right? Obviously that it's kosher, but even if it's kosher and cooked by a non-Jew, it can only be eaten if it has 2 conditions, or either condition. Either it's food that is usually eaten raw, or it is food that is not served at a king's table. What does that mean? The idea was that the Chachamim wanted to add a little bit of a distance, of a separation between Jews and non-Jews. And they said food that's usually served in a banquet, in a king's banquet, a king's table, that's something that you should avoid going to. But if it's common food, then if a non-Jew cooks it, you can eat it. So by the way, you should know that there was a big discussion throughout hundreds of years about potatoes. There was a time when potatoes was considered a rich man's food, in which was the case, the rabbis came out and said you can't eat potatoes cooked by a non-Jew. And then, of course, for many, many years, potatoes became a poor man's food, and then the rabbi said you can eat potatoes cooked by non-Jews. It's a very interesting proof of how, again, cultures of food change our attitudes toward them, and it also comes into halacha like this. However, there's another rule. Food that is usually eaten raw can be eaten cooked if a non-Jew cooks it. So, for example, take a stir fry of peppers, carrots, and tomatoes. If it's cooked by a non-Jew, you can eat it because carrots, peppers, and tomatoes are usually eaten raw. And therefore, if a non-Jew cooks them, you can eat them. My question is, what is the heter to drink beer that's made by a non-Jew, or whiskey, or coffee? Now, can you imagine if I would stop the shiur right now and say, you can't drink coffee, whiskey, and beer? I might create some heart attacks here. So I will continue. And I will say that all three of those drinks are permitted to be consumed, obviously on condition that they are kosher, but they are allowed to be consumed even if they're made by non-Jews. Well, the question is why? They're cooked, and they're cooked by a non-Jew. Now, one approach, and we find this in the poskim, was a debate whether or not these drinks were served at a king's banquet. Beer, for example, was, and I'm sure you know this more than I do, that beer originally was drunk instead of water, because in Europe water was very dangerous to be drunk, right, hundreds of years ago, because it was had right. Am I correct? So they used to drink beer instead of water, because water, people were getting sick out of drinking water because the water was very contaminated with different with who knows what. So beer was a common drink, and it was a very, very common drink. The common people drank beer. So you can argue that beer was not a king's banquet type of drink. Whiskey was developed much, much later. So some people really talk about this. And what about coffee? So I will show you that in my source sheet that I have in front of you. There is actually discussion about, is coffee considered a poor man's a drink or not? Here, let me go down a little bit. The Be'er Tev said that he who permits beer would permit coffee. And the Panim Me'irot argued that even by beer, the main reason was not because it was nullified, but rather because it was not served as a king's table. However, we have seen with our own eyes that coffee is served at king's table, and people invite others for it. So a careful person should avoid coffee and tea in non-Jewish stores. Now, this is a direct result of coffee at this time being an important drink. And it was only served maybe in fancy banquets. And therefore, these rabbis argued that you should not drink coffee if it was made by a non-Jew. However, other rabbis made another argument. Their argument was to permit coffee for another reason. And what's that reason? The reason being that coffee has two ingredients. It has water and it has beans. Both are cooked. But what is the main ingredient? If you argue that water is the main ingredient, then water is normally consumed in its raw form. And therefore, bishul akum, the prohibition to drink food or liquid made by a non-Jew, does not apply to a liquid drink that's based on water. How can we prove what is the more important ingredient? Well, some poskim, some rabbis argue, let's prove it from the bracha that we make on it. Coffee, what bracha do we make on coffee? Shahakol. Now, why is it shahakol? In coffee, we have coffee beans, and coffee beans come from a tree. You can't eat coffee beans. The only way to eat a coffee bean is to make it into coffee. And therefore, one could argue that the bracha on coffee should be ha'etz. I'll give you an example. Some people argued, and this is not what we do, don't worry, but some people argued that the bracha on chocolate should be ha'etz. Why? Because the chocolate, the cocoa bean, cannot be consumed as a cocoa bean, and it can only be eaten as chocolate. Its normal way of being consumed is in the form of chocolate. So that is the fruit. Therefore, it should make a bracha on ha'etz. So we don't go by that opinion. But some people prove from the fact that we make a shahakol on coffee proves that the main ingredient is water. And we just argued that water, if it's cooked by a non-Jew, does not affect the prohibition of bishul akum, and a Jew can drink, therefore, coffee that was made by a non-Jew. So coffee, tea, and whiskey, and beer, who also receive the bracha of shahakol, can be drunk by a Jew, even if a non-Jew brewed them. That's why it's very common today to drink whiskey and beer all over the world, even though it's obvious that they were not made by a Jew. So here again, we see evidence of the status of coffee and how it was looked upon in different societies as an important drink or not, which leads us to a third question regarding coffee. And this question has to do with, can you make havdalah on coffee? We know that many people have a custom that Motzei Shabbat, they use other liquids besides wine to make havdalah. I'm not going to talk now about grape juice. Grape juice, let's say, for the matter of discussion, is like wine. But some people drink juices for havdalah, beer. I'm not sure how people make whiskey, havdalah and whiskey at that time of night, but some people might make it on other liquids. The same way, by the way, there's a very famous custom, similar custom, to make Kiddush Shabbos morning on alcoholic beverages. What's interesting is no one questions making Kiddush Shabbos morning on coffee, because Kiddush Shabbos morning is a bit different than Havdalah. However, regarding Havdalah, the Gemara permits to make Havdalah on Chemar Medina. That's a term in Aramaic, which means the drink of the country. How would you define the drink of the country? What does that mean? Would Coca-Cola be considered an important drink for that purpose? Everyone agrees that you can't make Havdalah on water, because water is not an important drink. Now, what does that mean? Important. Water is the most important liquid in the world. What I think it means is, what type of drink is important by itself that you may drink it not because you're thirsty, right? Water is usually consumed when we're thirsty. You can argue that milk might be the same or not. Depends on habits of people. Coca-Cola is really not an important drink. And maybe we can use other ideas of what factor would make a drink important? I like to suggest a criteria for this question, which is not 100%, but I think it makes sense to some degree. I would like to suggest that any drink that you would go out with friends and meet on those drinks would be considered an important drink, which would include, therefore, alcoholic beverages. And according to what we were saying, it would include coffee and maybe even tea. Meaning, right, there's an expression today, let's go out for a cup of coffee. It's very interesting because a lot of times people use that phrase even if they don't mean that they're going to drink coffee. It just means, let's meet. And when we meet, we always do it on something where people like to always do something sociable over food, right? Have you ever heard of any social meeting that there's no food or drink? No, it doesn't happen. There's always something to eat or drink when we meet, when we gather together. So the expression to meet over a cup of coffee really proves that coffee is an important drink that is considered a drink that people meet over, that people will come together. And as a result, I believe the following source we can find in the Tzitz Eliezer, one of the more important poskim of the 20th century, who just died a few years ago. He says, Lefia anu da'ati, according to my humble opinion, if shar, in great need, he says, not lechatchila lahavdil al kafeh shachor, you can make havdalah on black coffee, va'afilu al kafeh im chalav, even coffee with milk. Biyot v'zeh hayom chemar medina. Says in the 20th century, one can argue that coffee has become the drink of the country, a accepted normative drink that is consumed by many people and therefore is considered objectively an important drink. And for the purpose of making havdalah, we could argue that it could be used for havdalah. So here are already 3 examples of how coffee came up in different questions regarding its in the context of a halachic question, but I try to prove that it's not just an interesting question, but in every generation, coffee and its importance in the community, or as it's looked upon, its importance of itself, created some ramifications to how the halacha can look at coffee. I think it's very interesting, by the way, because when I was a kid, a cup of coffee was just a cup of coffee, right? People just, you asked for a cup of coffee, so people just took instant coffee and gave you a cup of coffee. Today, everyone has their machines and their grinding machines and their fancy machines, and you drink this grain and that bean and from this person and from that person. It's really become a whole big thing. And I think that it's interesting to see that within halacha, we see that different questions regarding the change of how coffee became an important drink also moved around. I would like to end with one last question that comes up in the poskim regarding coffee, and that is, how does one make a cup of coffee on Shabbat? Here again, we are talking about a question that's very relevant, very practical to all of us. And what I find fascinating is that for many, many years, the classic question of making coffee on Shabbat was about, are you allowed to take instant coffee and pour over it hot water on Shabbat? Because it's bishul, right? One of the 39 melachot on Shabbat is that you're not allowed to cook. So if you pour hot water over instant coffee, you're cooking. So the reason why we permit it is because instant coffee is already cooked, right? When we have coffee in front of us, that's instant coffee, it went through some heat, it was heated, it was cooked, it was processed. And therefore, based upon the rule, ein bishul achar bishul, there's a rule that says you can't halachically cook something that has been already cooked. For example, let's say I want to heat on Shabbat my chicken. Why are you allowed to heat chicken on Shabbat on a hot plate? Because the chicken was already cooked before Shabbat. You can't recook something that was cooked. You can maybe reheat it, but you can't recook it. However, liquid, you can recook liquid. If I have hot water that was boiled before Shabbat, and I want to reheat it on Shabbat, reheating liquid is basically recooking. So normally we argue that you're not allowed to reheat liquid on Shabbat because that would be cooking it again. But you would be allowed to reheat solids because you can't recook. There's another discussion about a hot plate, which is another discussion which I'm not going to go into right now. Rav Sabag's, that's his headache. He'll have to talk to you about that if he didn't until now. That's another share of Rabbi Sabag's responsibility, not mine. But the idea of recooking, reheating food on Shabbat is permitted because you're not recooking, you're just reheating. So pouring hot water from an urn on instant coffee is not considered cooking, but reheating. But, and here's the but, here's the question. What about Turkish coffee? Turkish coffee in Israel is very common. I don't know if it's common in Turkey even, but in Israel it's very common. And it's sometimes very fun to give Turkish coffee to tourists that don't know what it is because they drink the whole thing at one shot together with all the butts, all the mud on the bottom. You have to know to leave the mud. So it's a famous old kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? Like a joke that people pull on people when they give them a little Turkish coffee. Anyway, Turkish coffee, like a fresh cup of coffee made out of filtered beans, is roasted, not cooked. And there's discussion in the poskim, do we apply the rule, ein bishul achar bishul, you can't cook something that was cooked, does that apply also to something that was roasted? Meaning, are you allowed to recook or reheat something that was roasted? The Rama says that milchatchila, that you should avoid cooking something that was only roasted. So that led to a question, wait a second, pouring hot water over fresh beans may be a problem on Shabbat because you are cooking the beans because they were only roasted and now you are cooking. Cooking is done with water. Roasted is done without water, right? How do you make beans today? You roast them, you put them in the oven, there's no water. So they're just roasted. But now by pouring hot water over them, you are cooking something that was roasted. And we really should not do that on Shabbat. So the question comes up today, and by the way, Rav Ovadia Yosef, who comes from the Sephardi community where they always drink Turkish coffee, had that problem too, right? What do you do? So if you go to the source sheet, and not to drink coffee on Shabbat, whoa, that's really going to be very difficult. How do we overcome this one? So Rav Ovadia Yosef has a tshuva, and he says, Hen emet, it's true that Rabbeinu Rama says that we should be machmir, we should really be careful not to cook after something is roasted. And if that's true, you're not allowed to pour boiling water over the beans on Shabbat. And therefore he says, our brothers, the Ashkenazim, should really be machmir. But we're the Sfardim. We don't go by this. We hold that you're allowed to pour boiling water over roasted food also on Shabbat. But the Ashkenazim amongst us, they really should not make Turkish coffee on Shabbat or should not have fresh cup of coffee. So that's really tough. So either you want to now become Sephardi and follow the Sephardi custom, or the other suggestion is an opinion of Rav Moshe Feinstein, who was one of the greatest Ashkenazi postmen of the 20th century, who argued that if you use a kli shlishi, meaning if you pour hot water from the urn into one cup, that cup now becomes a second cup, and it loses the original heat because the water is entering a cold cup. He argued that if you now take this second cup and pour the boiling water into a third cup, once you move the boiling water into a third cup, the third cup cannot cook anything on Shabbat. And therefore, you'd be permitted to pour that third cup of boiling water over the coffee beans on Shabbat and make your cup of coffee. I just want to say that I'm not going to go into this discussion, but according to the rabbis that I speak to and consult with, you would be allowed to also use a filter, a filter coffee on Shabbat, and there's no problem with borer, right? Because borer, people sometimes argue that you're separating the beans, but there's no separation here. All you're doing is you're dragging the coffee with the water into a cup, which is similar to a Gemara that talks about that you're allowed to pour water over grapes on Shabbat to make a grape juice by dragging the grapes with the water into a cup. And therefore, it would seem that it is permitted on Shabbat to pour water from a third cup of boiling water, right, transferred into a third cup, over freshly beans that were obviously, you're not allowed on Shabbat to grind the beans. That would be really, really prohibited. But once you grind them before Shabbat, you would be permitted to pour from a third cup of water, the water over the coffee and make yourself a fresh cup of coffee, or you can make yourself an instant cup of coffee and solve the problem by doing that. So Baruch Hashem, we concluded that there is a way to drink a fresh cup of coffee on Shabbat that goes together with the halacha. Some people might argue that the heter would be pikuach nefesh, but I hope that we're not that far into drinking coffee that would be the reason. So to conclude, I started today's Sjioer with connecting the appearance of coffee in Europe of the 16th century to the minhag of staying up all night, the night of Shavuot, and how the rabbis were attaching some kind of heavenly, signs to coffee, giving it great importance and great status because it permitted people, allowed people to daven Mariv, to do tikkun chatzot, to do tikkun leil Shavuot, tikkun Hoshana Rabbah. You can stay later in the Bet Midrash and learn Torah. So they really saw coffee as a godly drink. And as time went by, certain questions that came up regarding coffee and its status in the community created certain challenges and questions that we discussed today. Drinking coffee before davening. We discussed making coffee on Shabbat and using coffee for Havdalah. And the fourth question that we discussed was drinking coffee made by a non-Jew. Those are the four questions that I want to discuss, but I'll just let you know that there are more questions that come up regarding coffee. I'm not going to talk about now. One of them, by the way, believe it or not, had to do with whether or not coffee was considered kitniot. Yes, even coffee was challenged by the kitniot question, but that's for another discussion, not for now. But I find it very interesting. I, as you understand, really like coffee very much. I really enjoy a good cup of coffee. I got a little bit crazy about it too. I have my own coffee beans that I buy and make myself a fresh cup of coffee every morning. I enjoy my coffee. So I find this topic very interesting and very practical of how coffee was challenged in halacha through the generations and how it's still today raises certain questions. Anyway, someone asked me a question here. What's the question that people are asking? Wait a second. I'm getting a question about the Sjioer. Can everyone see the questions, or only I can see the questions?
No, it's private sent to you.
Oh, so yes, someone asked me, and the answer is, I believe that if you grind the coffee beans before Shabbat, you can use a filter, a hand filter. I'm not talking about a machine, of course, right? No machine. I'm talking about pouring water over a filter, right? I made myself clear, right, Rav Menachem? Is it clear what I said? I don't want anyone to think that I'm allowing to use a machine on Shabbat, chas v'shalom. You can't use a machine on Shabbat or a coffee maker.
You can buy here ready filters with the coffee inside it.
Yes, we have that too. That's made in Belgium, I think.
Right.
Right. So that's a great solution. You could buy that before Shabbat, and then on Shabbat, from a kli shlishi, pour the hot water over it and have a fresh filtered coffee on Shabbat. Beseder. I'll just end with one joke, if that's okay, Rav Menachem. I just said that kli shlishi, you can use a kli shlishi. A kli shlishi means I take hot water and from the urn, pour into 1 cup, that's a kli sheni, pour into kli shlishi. There were some rabbis that disagreed with the whole concept of kli shlishi. They said, it's boiling, what do I care? Kli shlishi, kli revi, kli chamishi, it's boiling. So the joke they used to use about it was that this guy reached 120, dies and goes to heaven. He comes to the Beis Din in the Shamayim, and they say to him, listen, you were a tzaddik, a great person. You're going to be in heaven. But there's one thing that you did in your life that really upset Kadosh Baruch Hu. This whole business of making coffee on Shabbos with a kli shlishi, what kind of joke is this? You use hot water on Shabbat. For that, you're going to be punished. What's your punishment? You're going to hell for the day, and they're going to punish you the way they know to punish you in hell. The guy says, okay, one day I can take it. He goes to hell, and they say, what we do in hell here is we give people hot showers. Okay. They put him in this hot shower, and it's boiling, and he's burning his skin. And he says, are you guys crazy? It's burning. They said, don't worry. We made it kli shlishi. Don't worry. So that's the joke about kli shlishi. And with that, I want to wish all of you a Chag Shavuot Sameach. And we should all be zocheh to receive the Torah mitoch simcha this Chag Shavuot. Thank you, Doron. Thank you, Rav Menachem. Thank you. I forgot your name.
Rabbijn.
I can't pronounce that. I'm sorry. You have to help me with that next time. And thank you all for coming and being in the Sjioer. As always, I always love to see the members of your community. And as you know, we are looking forward to having some of the members of the community join us. Please God, in a few months' time in Eretz Yisrael and Yeshivat Eretz Hatzvi. We're excited to see some of your congregation come join us. Chag Sameach, everyone.
Skauch, Rav Tabory.